Hello, my name is Dr. Erica Ligons, licensed clinical psychologist and founder and CEO of Crush That Exam. I'm really excited to come to you today to share with you some information about the common myths versus facts that there are floating around about the EPPP exam. But before we get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm so passionate about teaching about the EPPP. So I've been licensed almost 10 years, and I was lucky enough to be able to take the test straight out of graduate school. I took it during my postdoc year. But it wasn't without its challenges. And so I identify as a person of color and I'm also neurodivergent. And so going into this test, I had heard about the statistics of pass rates among certain groups of people. And on top of that, I had my own history, very long history of difficulty with standardized tests. My SAT scores were quite poor. My GRE score was so abysmal that I refused to apply to any school that required it. And so I was able to kind of skirt around that. But when it came to the EPPP, there was no choice but to take it if I wanted to be able to practice freely and independently in this field. And so I came into this process with a lot of anxiety, crippling anxiety, like curling up in a ball in fetal position type of anxiety. And I had no coach, no support, no plan, nothing. And unfortunately, I'm sad to say that all these years later, our field hasn't really evolved much in providing much guidance or support to new graduates who are embarking on this journey. And so I was out there floating, trying to figure this thing out. And so after about 6 months of a lot of avoidance, trepidation, crying spells, amongst many other challenges, I finally started to study, and I developed what I now call the snowball study method over the course of about 4 months of studying. And I created it sort of step by step. And during that time, I also worked really hard to change my mindset, to build some confidence for myself and reframe my thinking around the exam. In fact, I started referring to my exam date, which I didn't really tell anyone the date because I didn't want people knowing and having all the pressure, but I began to refer to my test date as my day of freedom. And so that helped me energetically to really change the way I was engaging and even thinking about the exam. So 4 months later, approximately, I took the exam and thankfully I was able to pass on the first try with a score of 659, despite being a person of color with ADHD and a history of poor performance on these types of exams. And so I was so relieved and overcome with joy that I was like, okay, I have to pay this forward. I have to start helping people to be able to overcome this exam. Just gonna pull this microphone a little closer to me. I wanted to be able to support others to not feel so alone and to feel so out of sorts in this process. So I just sort of started informally helping people around me who were postdocs coming to the program that I was working at the time and just giving them tips and strategies and supporting them. And after some time of doing this, it started to catch on, and a dear friend of mine encouraged me to actually become a coach. And at first, I was really nervous because I was like, well, how can I coach other people? I'm not sure. But I decided to give it a try. And that's where Crush That Exam was born. In 2019, I started just helping people informally and encouraging them and providing them the same strategies and overall method that I had applied to myself. And over the years, it has been a joy being able to be a part of people's journey to overcome this, watching people go through major transformations personally, finding their confidence, and also reframing their thinking about the exam. And so at Crush That Exam, it has been such a joy, and we absolutely love helping others. So I think, as I transition into talking about this topic, it's interesting in my own journey. Like I said, I had like no support. I had nothing. I, I don't know if it was available at the time, but I wasn't a part of any type of social media groups or anything, pages, nothing where I was following along and really engaged with other people in this process. And I wasn't on Reddit. I wasn't doing any of that. I mean, I was really in a silo. So the downside of that, again, is I felt horribly alone and had no one to really talk to. I think there was only one other postdoc at the site at that time, and they were not studying at the same time as me. They decided to kind of delay that and take their time. And so I really just didn't have anybody else to talk to. But I will say one of the benefits is that it did help me not to get caught up in a lot of the negative beliefs that are swirling around out there and a lot of misinformation. So there was kind of like, it was kind of like a blessing and a curse, I guess. So I really started to learn about some of the myths that I'm going to share with you today after I became a coach. And I started to hear the kinds of things my coaching clients were telling me that they believed about the exam. And I started to realize, oh, there's a lot of misinformation going on out there. So I'm excited to share with you just some of the top ones that I hear on a regular basis. There are more than this, but for the sake of this moment, I just want to share a few with you. So let's get into talking first and foremost about the purpose of this exam. Okay. There is a myth that goes around that people say a lot, which is that this exam is trying to keep good people out of this field, that it's a gatekeeping tool that is so awful as keeping good people out. Now, it is true that there are people who are excellent clinicians. I see them all the time. Amazing clinicians who have promotions waiting for them for the moment that they pass this test, who are struggling to pass. However, to say that the test is really out to get people or that it's trying to keep people out, I don't think is true. Now, where does all of that come from? Well, it comes from the statistics that we see. I mean, we see that Black and Brown people, for example, have horrific first time pass rates as compared to people who identify as white. And also other types of groups of people like neurodivergent people, older people, people who speak English as a second language. I haven't seen specific numbers on those groups because, to be honest with you, I don't know that there's been a lot of even effort or research put into that. But at Crush That Exam, the majority of the people that we see as of right now, about 70% of the people in our program identify as neurodivergent. So I'm interfacing a lot with these people, as well as people of color. Over 90% of our clientele on average at this moment identify as people of color. So we're seeing these people and we're seeing them being kept out of this exam. But I don't think it's something that the test is intentionally doing. I think that the truth, the fact is that yes, the pass rates are abysmal. But why is that happening? It's happening because of a lack of education and support for all people who are coming into this process. And we know that when there's not enough support, education, and guidance, those who have more vulnerabilities are more likely to have a negative outcome because they don't have the same level of resources and things like that to help them to get through. So, was the test intentionally crafted? Is there a group of people who are sitting there trying to plan how to keep people out? No, but it is one of the unfortunate consequences that does happen as a result of the whole entire licensure process not being set up to give people what they need to pass. And that's exactly why I'm so passionate about what I do as a EPPP coach is giving people that education and the resources and the plan that they need to be able to, get through this process. And so I encourage you to be very careful about telling yourself things like, They want me out. They don't want me. This is against good clinicians. This test shouldn't be here. It's gatekeeping the good people. Be careful about going down those rabbit holes. Instead, holding the truth, which is this process is extremely flawed and it does make groups more vulnerable who would be great psychologists from passing. But if we just provide better education and support and guidance, I believe that everyone can pass this test at equal level, which is brings us to the next myth, which is that certain groups of people can't pass the test. Again, in my experience as a person of color, neurodivergent, and doing so well on the exam, I know from my own personal experience that's just not true. And after several years of coaching, again, the vast majority of the people I'm working with are the very people that statistics say are least likely to pass. And yet we see on average 75% or more of the people that we work with are passing the same test. Not like they're taking a different test, they're taking the same test. The only difference is that they're doing it with proper guidance, support, and community. And that's what is making it so that they're able to pass pretty much at the same rate as people who identify as neurotypical and are not identifying as people of color. So everyone can pass this test. And that is the next piece of truth I want to give you. Everyone can pass this test. You can pass this test. I promise you that. As long as you have the right mindset, support, and plan, you can do it. Okay. Now let's keep going to another myth that I hear all the time, which is actually surprising because it's interesting because on one hand, we talk about how difficult and unfair the test is, and there's a lot of misinformation about that. But also, there's a lot of people who go into it really believing that they don't need to do much to prepare for it. So that's the next myth is that I don't really need to study for this. And you'd be surprised how often this happens where people go into the test and they haven't studied even a lick. Nothing, nada, at all. Or they've studied so little. So experts recommend that people should study 300 to 400 hours for an average of three over the span of about 3 to 6 months. And yet, what I consistently see when I'm coaching is people who are doing a lot less than that. I'm talking half, a quarter, an eighth of that. And they're repeatedly taking the exam and not having a good result. Now, why is this happening? Why are we walking around believing that a licensing test that is here to determine whether or not you can practice independently is something that we just don't really need to prepare for? Well, again, it's lack of information. A lot of people are just not aware that they need to study that much. No one sat them down and explained this to them. So they walked into it thinking, well, I've already got a degree in this, so what do I need to study this for? I know this stuff. Not realizing that half or more of the information on this exam are things that you learned in undergrad that you have not actively utilized and focused on for some years. So don't fall into the myth of thinking that you can just breeze through this and put a little hours here and there and be ready. The truth is that this requires several months of diligent, purposeful, and intentional preparation. And be careful about letting a few anomaly cases cause you to think that you can just wing it. Because that's another thing people fall into. They think because they have a friend who was able to study just a week or two or a month or a few hours and they somehow skated by, they think that they can do the same. No, most people need to put in several months of dedicated, diligent time and effort. Okay? So the next myth that I want to talk about is the version of the test you get. Now, this is very common. People think that because there are four different versions of this test floating around at any given time, which, by the way, they do vary in difficulty. Some are easier than others. But people think that passing this test comes down to which one they get. Couldn't be more false. Here's the thing. Even though some are harder, they have worked out the way that they do the grading of the test to ensure that it's equal. And this is on the ASPPP website. So I encourage you to please, they even have some additional facts and myths on there that that you should go look at. Educate yourself about this exam. In there, they talk about how if you get a test that's harder, you actually have to get fewer questions correct in order to be able to pass the test. And on the flip side, if you get a test, a version of it that is a little easier, you have to get more questions correct. But at the end of the day, everything is weighted equally. So it doesn't matter which one you get. You have to just get enough of them right. So sometimes my coaching clients will be in a very dark place, feeling like their whole fate in this process depends on whether or not they get an easy or hard exam. And what I want to do as a coach always is to empower people to let go of those unhelpful beliefs, those myths, and embrace the truth, which is that when you prepare properly and you put in the time and you're studying in a structured and effective way, and you work on reframing your thinking and you walk in with confidence in yourself, you can pass that test. Okay, so do not be thinking in your mind that it depends on which version you get. You can pass it no matter what you get. And that was actually one of the mantras I used to tell myself because even though I didn't know a lot about the exam going into it, one thing that I did hear through the grapevine was that a good portion of the test, and this is true, this is not a fact, or this is not a myth, is that a lot of the test, or a good portion of it, will feel, oh, sorry, my lights flickered a little bit, will feel foreign. Or it will feel like they're asking about things that you did study, but maybe asking about it in a slightly different way that might kind of throw you off a little bit and require some really good, like, critical thinking. So that is true. But I used to tell myself, you know what? I don't care if they throw weird stuff at me. I am going to develop strong test taking skills and good critical thinking, and I'm going to learn the content that is presented to me in the materials so well that I will be able to tease out the answers that don't make sense, and I'm going to be able to make strong, educated guesses and get the questions right no matter what, or at least enough right. Maybe not all of them, but enough right. And that really helped to soothe a lot of my anxiety and helped me to build more confidence in myself. Which brings me to another myth that people tend to swirl about. You know, the test is intense, it's an intense experience. And oftentimes, when people walk out of it, especially if they were not fully prepared in terms of content knowledge as well as emotional regulation, they may leave that test believing that the test was only heavily focused on certain areas and that other areas were not mentioned at all. So, how does this happen? Well, it is true that sometimes questions can be asked about in a particular way where you may not fully know which domain it's coming from, sometimes. But again, a lot of it is just the fact that they present new information that you may not have seen. And so here's the thing, when it comes to what's on the test, what areas are represented, We have six major areas as of right now: clinical psychology, also known as treatment intervention, biobases, which is like physiological, psychopharmacology type stuff, lifespan development, organizational psych, ethics, and is that all of them? Clinical, IO. Oh, and psychopathology, which is like the DSM diagnoses, right? And then we've got five other little minor areas, which include like learning and memory, test construction, psych assessment, social psychology, and stats and research. And so what ends up happening is usually the area that people struggle with the most, they might be more inclined to feel like their test was heavily based on those things versus some of the other things that they felt stronger in. But what we know to be true is the first six areas that I mentioned, those major ones, those are the ones that are most heavily emphasized. And those other ones, like the psych assessment, social, test construction, that stuff like that, that's like about 30% of the exam. Those other five minor areas, about 30%, 25 to 30-ish percent of the exam is based on that stuff. The other 65, 70, something like that, 75% is on those other areas. So it doesn't mean, and all of the areas are represented on the test, even if it's less, obviously less proportion than others, all of those areas are represented on every single test. But you'll have people saying things like, there was no clinical questions on my exam, or there were no questions about social psych. But then when you see their bar graph, because unfortunately, if you fail the test, you do get a bar graph, which shows you the breakdown of the areas of the different areas and where you excelled and where you had a little more difficulty. It's going to show that. And you will literally see on the bar graph that there were indeed questions on social, but yet the person will sit there and tell you there was no questions on my test about social psych. Because again, it's the emotions talking. It's the overwhelm, the stress, the lack of preparedness that they were experiencing going into the exam that left them bewildered during it. And even when we pass, we can be what is the word? Susceptible, I think I'm saying that right, to, or maybe not, but anyway, to uh, emotional reasoning, feeling like that because something felt a certain way, that that's how it was. I mean, even on my own exam, I walked out feeling like there was 50 stats questions on my exam. Now, were there 50 stats questions? No, it was probably more like 8 to 10, based on how the exam is broken down. But emotionally, I felt as though there was like 50. And so, and I actually thankfully was able to pass and do really well. And I still kind of had that thought, even though I know it's not true. So be careful of listening to things like that. Like, oh, there's not going to be any questions on this or that or whatever. And be careful about believing those things for yourself after your own experience. Because the more you keep telling yourself these kind of things, like, well, I studied all this and that, and it wasn't even on there, then the more you get to this hopeless, helpless place where you just feel like passing is all due to chance. And you have to be very careful with that line of thinking because, again, the deeper you go into that, the more you'll miss the opportunity to really prepare properly and set yourself up for success in passing the exam. So let me share a couple more with you. Another one in regard to how the questions are sort of laid out is a lot of people will say that they can tell which questions are the experimental ones. So right now, the test includes 50 experimental questions that will not be scored, but they do not mark them or let you know in any kind of way which ones are the ones that are being scored and which ones are not. But I've heard sometimes people putting a belief out there that you can tell. Here's what I need you to do. Not waste even an ounce of your time or energy trying to figure out whether a question is experimental or not. Treat them all the same. Do your best as you can on all of them and let the rest go. Okay? Because again, when you start diving into that dark place of trying to figure out the exam and all of that, it's a waste of your time and energy. Instead, focus your energy on learning the content, learning good basic test taking skills, which is another myth I'll get to in a second, and just focus on evaluating answers and choosing the best one. Don't overcomplicate this. Don't let these myths and these urban legends get to you and have your head spinning and having you put time and energy where it doesn't need to be. Which is also brings me to another myth, which is that you need some super expert, top secret magic sauce test taking skills. You don't. In fact, I would say the vast majority of what comprises strong test taking skills is literally just A, knowing the content, and B, this emotional regulation. That is the biggest part of this. You just staying calm enough and believing in yourself and not going down spirals is what is going to determine how well you can read, interpret answers, and find the right one, and even interpret the questions. So, even though, yes, some of the questions on the exam can be excessively wordy, written sometimes in convoluted ways, not all of the questions are like that, but even of the ones that are, you can still read between the lines and figure out what it's saying and find the best answer without having Jedi level, test taking skills, right? And even for those of you who do not speak English as a first language, a lot of times they will feel extra scared about the way the questions are worded. And although, yes, being a non-native English speaker is going to require you to put in more studying, more time, and it will take you having to really comb through those questions in even more meticulous way to counter for the language difference. I have worked with so many people who do not speak English as their first language, and they have crushed this exam. And so do not think that you need to go spend millions of dollars or go on this crusade to try to develop these supernatural test taking skills. It's just not needed. So that brings me to another thing that I want to share, which is around how the test is scored. And I mentioned a little bit before, but I want to circle back to another piece of that. So, as we all know, you get your score immediately when you take the EPPP. And again, that is because, as I already mentioned, it is predetermined for each version how many questions you need to get right. But there is a myth that it is graded on a curve, that it depends on who's taken the test recently, and they have to normalize everything based on that group of people. And then that's how you get determined if you pass or not. And this myth has driven people to go again on crusades to try to figure out where they should take the test, when they should take it, because they're trying to figure out where people who have had lower scores, where they all are, and when they just took the test so they can go try to take the test at the same time as them. Don't waste your time. Again, tests that are graded on a curve, typically they're only offered certain times throughout the year because they have to corral the people together into cohorts. And then once everybody takes the test in that cohort, you have to wait usually several weeks in order for them to normalize and do all the algorithm stuff and score everything and do all the mathematical stuff to determine the curve and how they're going to grade people. That is not how it works. Like I said, with EPPP, you're getting your score right away. So you know before you walk out that door what you got. And so again, do not fall into this misinformation. Do not have yourself thinking that your fate depends on this person or that person or that person and how they scored. This is the power to pass this test is in your hands as long as you have the right support, mindset, and plan. And that's the biggest thing I want you to walk away from hearing what I'm saying today is that you can do this. It is possible. You just have to believe and have the right supports. And so I hope that you got a lot of good information from this. I hope that this helped to calm some of your fears. I think one of the things I just wish I could do is go around to like every person and just like shake confidence into them because I think back in my own journey, just how much anxiety I had, how much fear I had, how much overwhelm I felt. And if I had just had someone to share this information with me and point me in the right direction, it just would have been a whole lot calmer, at least at first. I got there eventually, I found my confidence and whatnot, but I had to go through a lot to get there. And so I hope that this helps you to have more confidence and to see that this test is truly passable. And so thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Again, my name is Dr. Erica Ligons, founder and CEO of Crush That Exam, and passionate EPPP coach, and just super excited to continue to help people like you to find their confidence and crush that exam. Thank you.